At first, there was only light. It pressed against his eyelids, a pale shimmer that seemed to move rather than shine. He could not tell how long he had been lying there. When he finally opened his eyes, the brightness washed over him in a soft pulse. The space around him slowly resolved. He sensed a curvature above him, not a ceiling exactly, but a surface that shifted like a membrane. Along one side, faint shapes glowed and then dissolved. For a moment he thought he saw streets or rooftops or a shoreline falling away, shrinking as if seen from rising height. Then the forms folded in on themselves and vanished. His breath caught. Something moved close by. He turned his head. The brightness thinned, and the outlines near him came into focus with slow insistence. Two figures stood a little way off. The first thing he registered was the head, far too large for the narrow body that supported it. Then the eyes, wide and slanted, darkening toward the outer edges as though rimmed with shadow. They held their gaze on him without blinking, patient and unhurried. Below the eyes was a small round mouth, slightly open, as if caught between forming a sound and exhaling. Only after a long moment did he notice the collar-like frill around each figure's neck. The pointed extensions caught the ambient light and broke it into soft edges. Was it dress? Was it skin? He drew in his shoulders. This was not an adventure. The churning fear suffocated him. During the night of 23rd to 24th of February 1977, the weather around Lake Constance was murky. The sky was largely overcast and a weak easterly breeze was blowing. The waxing moon had already set by midnight. In the early morning hours, 27-year-old Lothar Schäffler was driving 52-year-old Rudi Gruch home in his green Citroën 2CV. The two men had spent the evening in Langenargen and left the Mag Bar near the train station at about 2 a.m. A few minutes later, they reached the parking lot of the Waldeck Café. Langenargen, a town of over 5,000 residents on the northeast shore of Lake Constance, has long been a heavily visited recreation area. The Bierkeller Waldeck, 2 kilometers north of the town center, and the site of several reported UFO incidents earlier that same year, had once sheltered an air observation post during the Second World War. As Gruch climbed out of the car, Schäffler, still seated behind the wheel, noticed something shining in the sky and called out to him. He saw lights that were still far away, yet already shining with marked intensity. Through the tall spruce trees at the edge of the parking lot and above the gable of the Waldeck Café, the two men could see 2 bright points of light approaching in a straight path from the direction of Switzerland across Lake Constance. Gruch, who said he had flown 33 missions with the Ju-52 during the Second World War and had later served as a paratrooper in the Africa campaign, estimated the altitude of the objects at roughly 1,000 meters. About a minute later, Schäffler also stepped out of the car. Gruch was immediately dazzled by a bluish-white brilliance from 4 circular searchlight-like sources on the front of each object, so strong that he had to shade his eyes with his hand. Gruch, who wore light prescription glasses and had poor hearing, could not discern further structural details. Schäffler believed he could make out faintly defined oval contours against the dark sky. Gruch was unsettled. "I have never seen anything like it before," he later stated. The 2 objects continued to draw closer until they were about 500 meters away, then remained stationary for roughly 5 minutes, their lights sweeping across the immediate surroundings. Each object appeared larger than a Sikorsky S-58 helicopter. Both witnesses were struck by the intensity of the light. 1,000 halogen lamps would have been no more than a candle flame in comparison, Gruch later said. Schäffler described the beams as whiter than sunlight, comparable to the burst of a camera flash. Schäffler, who had served with a helicopter unit of the German army in Laupheim and was therefore familiar with the appearance and behavior of military aircraft, began to question what he was witnessing. Alouette choppers do not carry lights that bright. and the sound I hear is no helicopter noise at all, but a high-pitched whistling. A chopper would have shaken the entire neighborhood awake." His remark pointed both to the absence of the heavy rotor beat he knew well and to the mismatch between the observed illumination and standard aviation lighting. As an electrician, he added that to generate light of such brilliance, one would have to install something like an entire power plant on board, a comment underscoring his impression that the luminosity exceeded what aircraft of the period could plausibly produce. The objects remained stationary in the sky for about 2 minutes, an aspect that further puzzled the witnesses, since hovering at that altitude without rotor noise did not correspond to any aircraft known to them. The two objects then drifted slowly toward one another until they seemed to touch. Suddenly, the things just disappeared, as though turned off. Grutch looked immediately at his watch. It was exactly 2:10 in the morning, a detail he later repeated consistently. Questions about witness reliability arose during the investigation. It remained uncertain whether Grutch might have been inebriated, since he declined to undergo psychological testing that could have clarified his condition and perceptual accuracy that night. Schaeffler, by contrast, acknowledged drinking 4 or 5 glasses of wine at the Mag Bar, a quantity that could raise doubts about precision of observation, but a subsequent police blood alcohol test showed a value of less than 0.03%, indicating that he was essentially sober. Shortly after 2:30 in the morning, Rudy Grutch said goodbye to Lothar Schaeffler and went inside the house. As he started up the stairs, he glanced out of a ground floor window and saw the unknown flying objects appear again. This time they came from the northeast and seemed much closer than before. Grutch estimated their distance at roughly 150 meters and their altitude at 50 to 60 meters. Once again, he saw 2 objects with 4 lights, and these lights illuminated the backyard and the neighboring houses so intensely that the surroundings appeared as bright as day. The innkeeper stepped closer to the window, approaching to within half a meter of the closed pane, when he suddenly felt unable to move any farther forward. He later described this not as a physical obstruction, but as an inexplicable inability to move forward. During this time, the intensely bright objects continued to approach. Grutch noticed that Schaeffler was still outside, moving around the yard in apparent confusion, first ducking to the right behind bushes near the kitchen extension, and then rising again and running around the far corner of the kitchen toward the other side of the house. Unable to call out to him, Grutch reported that he then saw an indistinct shadow in front of the built-on kitchen, shaped somewhat like a small barrel and swaying back and forth. It appeared to him to be directly in the path of Schaeffler's flight. During a follow-up questioning on April 6th, he was asked about the duration of these events. Grutch replied, "I had lost all sense of time. To me, it was just too long." He estimated that after 2 or 3 minutes, though he could not say precisely, the objects again began to move toward one another, as they had in the first sighting. This time, the 2 innermost lights seemed to fuse and then vanish. The remaining lights continued to drift closer together until they too merged and disappeared. Unfortunately, Schaeffler was unable to verify this spectacle later on, since he had been unable to look directly at the lights because of their terrific brightness. Grutch recalled, "First it was 8, then 6, then 4, then 2 lights, and finally 1. The last light even seemed to get bigger. The fusion process happened in jumps or jerks. Immediately afterward, he heard cries for help and the sound of breaking glass. At that moment, he found he could move again and hurried to the upstairs window, hoping to gain a clearer view from there. But outside, everything was already dark. He remained at the window for a while longer before going into the bedroom, shaking all over. Mrs. Grutch, awakened by the noise Schaeffler was making outside, at first assumed a burglar was trying to break into the house. The next-door neighbor, Mrs. Burkhart, who had no telephone, called to her from an open window, urging her to contact the police at once. She too initially suspected an attempted break-in. Mrs. Grutch then called the police station in Friedrichshafen. Seeing her agitated husband, who kept whispering that he had just experienced something too impossible to believe, she did not press him for an explanation, but dressed quickly, intending to go over to the neighbors. Meanwhile, Lothar Schaeffler, had been undergoing what he later described as a period of terror. Shortly after the sudden disappearance of the objects, and just as he was about to climb into his car, he saw the light flare up in the sky once again. This time there was only one object, and it was very near. Its enormous size filled him with overwhelming fear. He tried to follow Grutsch into the house, running first to the south entrance and then to the north, but all the doors were locked. The object emitted an extremely high-pitched, piercing tone that was sharp but surprisingly low in volume and of constant intensity. Locked out of the house, Schaeffler ran along the kitchen wall and threw himself to the ground among the small bushes near the backyard fence. The light kept coming closer. He later estimated its distance at 50 to 80 meters, and its height at about 18 meters above the ground. By this point, the entire area was illuminated so blindingly bright that Schaeffler no longer felt secure, even in this hiding place, and ran toward the rear entrance of the Burkhardt house, the next-door neighbors. There, Schaeffler suddenly heard a short whistling sound, from very high to low frequencies, felt a slight draft of air, and then, as though conjured out of nothing, he saw two strange, alien-looking beings standing directly behind him. The figures were no more than about 1.30 meters and 1.10 meters tall, respectively. Their bodies were somewhat human in outline, although their long arms reached almost to below their knees. Their oddly cramped fingers were also conspicuous, reminiscent of the fingers of spastic children. Apart from a kind of frill around the neck, similar to a harlequin collar with 6 or 7 light green star-like serrations, Schaeffler could not make out any further articles of clothing. Their skin appeared somewhat lighter than human skin. Their hairless heads were completely round, as were their clearly defined mouths. No nose or ears were visible, nor did they seem to have necks. The strange figures rocked their torsos slowly back and forth. At the same time, their eyes, which Schaeffler described as like the Chinese, slanted, but not as narrow, and big like cow's eyes, stared at him without blinking. Schaeffler stood paralyzed with fear. The larger being was about 1 meter away from him, while the smaller one was positioned to his left at a 90-degree angle. Schaeffler recalls, "I stared at them, and they stared at me, and then I simply went nuts." Although the figures made no gestures suggesting aggressive intentions, Schaeffler fell into a state of panic. He threw himself against the Burkhardt door and cried for help, but the door was locked. In his desperation, he impulsively smashed the upper middle pane of glass and reached through to unlock the door from the inside. Once inside, he collapsed onto the floor. He did not look back. At least he did not remember looking back. Later, regression hypnosis would reveal that something lifted him off the ground. His limbs grew light, and he found himself drifting upward in a way that made no sense to him. The blood dripping, the security of inside, all these carnal things could not hold him in place. By the time the house tenants arrived, everything had vanished, the beings as well as the lights. Mr. and Mrs. Burkhardt, the Grutsch family's next-door neighbors, later reported that someone rang their doorbell repeatedly for about 15 minutes, beginning around 3:30 in the morning. Eventually, they heard cries and calls for help, followed by the sound of breaking glass at the door. Only then did Mrs. Burkhardt get out of bed, although she hesitated to go to the door to see who was there. After that, everything fell quiet for about 5 to 8 minutes. From their roof window, Mrs. Burkhardt finally called across to the neighboring window of the Grutsch house. "Mrs. Grutsch, someone was trying to break in. Call the police." In Friedrichshafen, Police Sergeant Kruger answered the call and immediately notified the nearest patrol car. After a while, Mr. and Mrs. Burkhardt ventured cautiously down the stairs. In the hallway, they found Lothar Schaeffler lying prostrate on the floor, his hand bleeding. When he saw them, he called out in his Swabian dialect, "They're flying around up yonder," and pointed excitedly toward the sky. The Burkhardts, who saw nothing unusual outside, assumed that Schaeffler, a complete stranger to them, was either drunk or mentally disturbed. They suspected he had been involved in a fight because he had blood smeared across his face from his injured hand. The police arrived within a few minutes. They immediately concluded that the scene did not resemble an attempted burglary. Toward 4 in the morning, the police brought Schaeffler to the Friedrichshafen hospital. There, the staff examined his hand and bandaged 2 fingers that had been lacerated by glass shards. At first, the officers assumed that his behavior might be the result of hallucinations brought on by alcohol delirium. Their view changed when the blood alcohol test showed a value of only 0.03%. They later remarked that they were surprised that several scientists took the witnesses' account seriously, given the general lack of reliable information about the UFO phenomenon. Toward 5 in the morning, they called Schaeffler's mother. She had been understandably worried about her son's absence, and they tried to reassure her. Schaeffler finally arrived home around 6. The following day, Schaeffler told his colleagues what had happened. He was ill and unable to work. His friend and colleague Wolfram Nafts from the telecommunications unit urged him to report the incident to the press, hoping this might lead to other witnesses coming forward. Both Grutsch and Schaeffler expected that many of their friends and neighbors would react with mockery and derision, yet they decided to follow the suggestion. A short notice therefore appeared in the Bild-Zeitung on the 2nd of March 1977. In essence, it read like this: UFOs over Lake Constance, seen by 8 witnesses. Neither the German Federal Railways employee Schaeffler, nor the innkeeper Rudi Grutsch, nor even Mr. Zern want to claim to have drunk too much that night on Lake Constance when the alleged UFOs appeared. I drank 4 beers at the most, Mr. Schaeffler professes. It was last week, Thursday, 2 o'clock in the morning, when Mr. Schaeffler came out of his favorite bar in Langenargen. Suddenly, a shrill howling and brilliant searchlight beams. From a height of about 50 meters, 2 shapes dove toward me with a deafening noise. I screamed for help and ran away. Mr. Schaeffler was so frightened that he jumped through a pane of glass in his fear. Innkeeper Grutsch verifies. The parking lot in front of my bar was lit up as bright as day by the dazzling light. 5 other neighbors also claimed to have seen and heard the 2 UFOs. Lothar Schaeffler described the experience in more detail to the Schwäbische Zeitung in Friedrichshafen on March 4th. The article reported the following statement. When asked whether he had noticed the shapes of any occupants in the strange object, Mr. Schaeffler declined to answer. That point I wish to discuss with experts only. As a result, scientists at MUFON-CES, the Central European section of the Mutual UFO Network, and a scientific group of researchers and engineers were able to investigate the witnesses' reports quietly, without interference from publicity or sensationalized coverage. In the days that followed, additional people came to the Waldeck Café and reported that they too had observed unusual things during the night in question. 2 of these new witnesses were interviewed directly by MUFON-CES members. A 3rd witness described his experience over the telephone. Within 100 meters of the Waldeck Café, in a northeasterly direction, lives the Brielmeier family on Buchenstrasse. While her husband slept through the early morning hours of February 24th, Mrs. Brielmeier, 65 years old, was taking a bath long after midnight. Shortly after she lay down in bed, she heard a loud whistling noise in the sky. Then she heard someone yelling. Mrs. Brielmeier opened the bedroom curtains beside her bed and had an unobstructed view toward the kindergarten and the Waldeck Café. The sky to the left of the Grutsch and Burkhardt semi-detached house was brightly illuminated. Mrs. Brielmeier could not understand why none of the residents east of the Waldeck Café had heard or seen any trace of the objects. She herself reported hearing cries, and shortly afterwards, the jingling of falling glass shards. Immediately after that, the coloring in the sky disappeared. The entire spectacle may have lasted no more than 2 minutes, although she could not say for certain. Another witness, Karl Brugger, lived in Endringet Manor, 1.4 kilometers from Bierkeller Waldeck, shortly before Oberdorf. Farmer Brugger woke up suddenly in the middle of the night and at first thought he had overslept because it was as bright as day outside in the direction of the Bierkeller. He then looked out of the window. It looked as if the police had set up a warning light, like the ones you see on the Autobahn after there has been an accident. It was extremely bright, brighter than the floodlights in a soccer stadium. It looked like a brilliantly lit searchlight, but considerably brighter. Taking a quick look at the clock on the night table, I saw that both hands were already past midnight. Brugger did not notice the exact time. The size of the light had been difficult for him to judge, but he thought it might have been about half the diameter of the full moon. At a distance of 1.4 kilometers, this would correspond to an object roughly 17 meters across. A supplementary report came from Friedrichshafen, 10 kilometers north of Bierkeller Waldeck. Wolfram Nafts, Lothar Schäffler's friend and colleague, heard from a railway man whom he knew only by first name, and who shortly thereafter moved to Ulm, that the man's wife had also seen a bright spectacle in the sky on the night of Ash Wednesday. She had been driving home from Oberthüringen to Friedrichshafen together with a colleague. When the two women saw the mysterious bright lights in the direction of Langenargen, they became alarmed and stopped at a sports club that was still open, waiting there until the light disappeared. As so often happens in such cases, they did not draw attention to what they had witnessed, fearing that others might laugh at them. About 1 kilometer northwest of the Waldeck Café, in Schwede, stands the radio and direction finding southern headquarters of the 7294 Corps Regiment. Captain Kotz stated that the station had recorded no unusual radar returns or interference during the time in question, and that no relevant tape recordings existed. Fritz Meyer, editor of the Schwäbische Zeitung in Friedrichshafen, arrived at the same negative result. He obtained his information from the nearest German Army radar station in Kempten and from a Swiss colleague at the Air Traffic Control Center in Zurich. 7 years later, it emerged that an unidentified flying object had in fact been detected by the military. Apparently, the object, or objects, had come directly from Italy. As reported in the Münchner Merkur on November 11, 1980, based on information supplied by the SAD Rome agency, the Italian Defense Ministry had made public that during the night of February 23rd to 24th, 1977, a UFO had followed an Italian Air Force fighter for 23 minutes. The object was surrounded by a very bright halo of light. During the pursuit, the aircraft and the object covered a distance of approximately 375 kilometers. The object disappeared only after making a 270-degree turn over the Po Valley. Lothar Schäffler's friend and co-worker, Wolfram Nafts, reported that Schäffler came to work the day after his experience looking deathly pale. He seemed absent-minded and vomited several times. During the following days, he often had to be addressed repeatedly before he reacted. While driving, he would at times appear to drift away, as though his attention had left the present moment. Occasionally, he tuned off for minutes at a time. Half a year later, he still behaved as if he were a different person. He was no longer as jolly as before, had become quiet, and remained occasionally absent-minded. While mountain climbing, he was always freezing, something that had never been the case previously. In the first weeks after the UFO encounter, Schäffler suffered from insomnia and nightmares. He kept a lamp burning at night because of anxiety. At times, he would awaken between 2 and 3 in the morning, even though he had previously slept through the night without disturbance. 2 days after the encounter, he suddenly broke out in a heavy sweat while sleeping in the early evening and was soaked to the skin. He stated that nothing like this had ever happened to him before. 2 weeks later, he developed a stomach ulcer, and his doctor sent him for 3 weeks of rehabilitation. What bewildered Schäffler above all, and what he could not explain, was the course of time during the encounter. According to Rudi Grutsch, the main events must have taken place between 2:10 in the morning and shortly after 2:30. Yet the Burkhardt family did not report hearing their doorbell until about an hour later, and only after another 15 minutes did they hear the breaking of the glass. Schäffler therefore assumed that further fragments of the actual events were still buried in his subconscious and might perhaps be recoverable through hypnotic regression. The depth of his shock would become fully apparent only during the subsequent investigations by MUFON-CES psychologists. Rudi Grutsch was also deeply affected, at least for several days. Shortly after the sighting, he was a nervous wreck and moved about for 3 days as though in a fever. On the 3rd day after the occurrence, he began to experience hallucinations. Since Mr. Grutsch refused to participate in any psychological testing that might have helped establish his credibility, it was assumed that on the night in question, he was not sober enough to grasp all details clearly. MUFON-CES therefore rated his reliability at only 50%. During a supplementary examination of the sighting area on April 6th, 6 weeks after the UFO incident, MUFON-CES physicists used a Geiger counter to measure possible radiation. No elevated levels of radioactivity were detected. The physicist, Dr. Walter Schiebeler, had already carried out a similar search with a Geiger counter on March 6th, likewise without any alarming results. An examination of the metal fence posts with a magnetic compass revealed no indication of magnetization. No physical traces were found. Contrary to what is reported in some similar cases, Schaeffler did not feel that the air temperature increased noticeably during the closest approach, despite the intense light. On September 12, 1977, one of the investigators, Mr. von Ludwiger, received a call from the primary witness's physician, who asked for assistance in his patient's treatment. Schaeffler had become addicted to pills. When Dr. Z investigated the cause of this addiction, she could not explain how her patient had suddenly developed a stomach ulcer. Schaeffler himself said that the only effect he had felt was that he slept well after taking the medication. At the investigator's urging, he underwent psychotherapeutic treatment and has since overcome both his anxiety and his dependence of pills. MUFON-CES concluded that the physiological and psychological aftereffects shown by the witness corresponded to what is expected in a close encounter case. Since the unusual light of February 24, 1977, was observed by 6 independent witnesses from several different locations, investigators concluded that the phenomenon had an objective basis. Its physical reality could therefore be regarded as established. The report of 2 shapes seen by Lothar Schaeffler, however, raised additional questions, and investigators considered this aspect of the case uncertain. To clarify the reliability of the primary witness, investigators initiated psychological testing. Their aim was to assess Schaeffler's general credibility, including mental health and truthfulness, and to determine whether a more extensive inquiry would be warranted. For this purpose, they employed the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, in the version translated and adapted for German patients by the University of Saarbrücken. Because the test material was standardized and empirically constructed, investigators regarded it as a reliable tool. It was designed to reveal unconscious conflicts and to support preliminary psychiatric evaluation. Based on responses to specific questions, the test allows clinical inferences concerning tendencies toward lying, alcoholism, paranoia, depression, hysteria, and schizophrenia. 3 months after the incident, Schaeffler completed the Personality Index evaluation, which indicated no abnormal personality traits and showed a normal lie index. Investigators then shifted to the Rorschach test, arguing that only a projective method could address the perceptual quality of the experience. The Rorschach, however, is inherently dependent on expert interpretation and cannot reliably support broad claims about personality without substantial clinical caution. Siegfried Streubel administered 3 Rorschach examinations over 12 years. His reading of the first test suggested that Schaeffler's responses were dominated by emotionally charged material for which no alternative life events could be identified, and he interpreted this as evidence that the witness had indeed undergone a distressing experience. On this basis, investigators assigned Schaeffler a reliability estimate of 90% and treated his report of 2 figures as, to some extent, reliable. As a research design, this sequence provides limited evidentiary value. The projective tests confirm that Schaeffler was distressed, but they cannot establish what caused the experience or whether the perceived figures correspond to an external event. The interviews revealed contradictions concerning the appearance and duration of the light phenomenon. The time of its disappearance, around 3:35 in the morning, appears firm. If the proprietor of the mag bar did in fact close at 2 o'clock, this would agree with the time given by Grutsch, who together with Schaeffler first observed the lights at the beer keller roughly 10 minutes later. According to both men, this first sighting lasted only about 5 minutes. After it ended, Schaeffler returned to his car. His second encounter with the objects was also estimated by him to have lasted about 5 minutes. What remained unresolved, and what troubled Schaeffler most, was how an entire hour could have vanished from his memory and what might have taken place during that interval. By the time the Burkharts heard their doorbell and the police were called, far more time had passed than what his estimates allowed. A simpler explanation, of course, is that the mag bar did not close until 3 o'clock, and that Grutsch misread or misremembered the time when he looked at his watch. Because Schaeffler insisted that he wanted to know the truth by any means, MUFON-CES investigators proposed exploring his recollection further with the assistance of a hypnotherapist. The primary purpose of the hypnosis sessions was to clarify the length of the individual episodes on February 24th. For the hypnotherapist, this presented a familiar difficulty. On the one hand, a traumatic blockade might have to be addressed. On the other hand, there was the risk that the witness might simply confabulate details to fill the period of amnesia. In UFO cases, a distinction is usually drawn between those in which an encounter with unusual beings is first described under hypnosis, and those in which the witness already has a clear idea of the beings before hypnosis begins. Schaeffler belonged to the latter category. It was therefore evident to the investigators that the appearance of the figures he reported was not generated during hypnosis. Through the mediation of the parapsychologist Professor Hans Bender in Freiburg, Professor Klaus Bick, director of the Pfälzer Fels Sanatorium in Daun, agreed to conduct the hypnosis sessions with Schaeffler. As secretary of the International Union of Hypnotherapists, and with experience in nearly 1,000 hypnotherapeutic treatments, Professor Bick was aware of the risk that a hypnotist may consciously or unconsciously influence a subject's responses. For that reason, he requested not to be informed of the details of Schaeffler's report prior to the sessions. The first session, held on June 12, 1977, was devoted to establishing the sequence of events on February 24th, posing control questions, and preparing Schaeffler for deeper hypnosis. During this conversation, Schaeffler stated that he had not read anything about UFO phenomena apart from a few brief newsletter items. Asked what he feared most, he replied that he would be greatly disturbed if others considered him not altogether quite there. In the second session, Schaeffler was placed in deep hypnosis, and an attempt was made to recover any experiences that might have been repressed or blocked during the missing period. During the conversation, it emerged that Schaeffler believed he might have been inside the object, although he stated that he had lost consciousness and could not recall further details. The only new impression that surfaced during the session was his sense of being lifted from the ground. "Do you have the feeling that you were inside the object?" asked Bick. "I was away from the ground, that is the feeling I had," replied Schaeffler. "You were not on the ground. Where were you?" asked Bick. "Away from the ground, I do not know. I only know that the object was getting brighter, and afterwards I was on the ground again, and those two were standing next to me," said Schaeffler. The regressive hypnosis brought several forgotten details about the beings to light, such as the presence of a nose, the number of fingers, and movements of the mouth, although the remaining experiences still remained inaccessible. In the first interview, Schaeffler believed he had seen the beings for only 5 seconds. Under hypnosis, he estimated the duration of the confrontation at 5 minutes. A further session of regressive hypnosis would have increased the risk of confabulation for the reasons already mentioned. The witness was therefore advised to attempt to recall the events without external influence by noting as many dreams as possible. Additional material was to be explored later through dream analysis. The case was reviewed with Dr. H. Bjarsch, a psychiatrist in Berlin, who noted that the timing of the event, the night after Fasching, would ordinarily raise suspicion of alcohol-related misperception, though Schaeffler's presentation did not show psychotic tendencies. Both Bjarsch and other consulted psychiatrists agreed that hallucinations cannot be produced by fear alone, and that the combination of a bright airborne light with small figures does not match usual hallucinatory patterns. Although Lothar Schaeffler was no longer the uncomplicated person he had been before the incident, he managed within a year to return to an outwardly normal day-to-day life and spoke only occasionally about the sighting in February. In July 1980, a colleague contacted MUFON-CES on his behalf, since Schaeffler, due to nervousness, was unable to speak to investigators himself. The colleague asked whether it was common for witnesses in close encounter cases to feel threatened by mysterious individuals. Schaeffler had fainted and injured his hand on a broken bottle when he fell. The episode of unconsciousness had brought back the memory of a threat he believed he had received from a man who had warned him that something would happen if he ever spoke about his experience, which he had just done. In an effort to calm him, Mr. Streubel and Mr. von Ludwiger visited Schaeffler's mother, who explained how his present state of nervousness had begun. One evening in September 1978, around 9 o'clock, Schaeffler was walking home from the direction of Lake Constance. On an otherwise empty street lined with single-family houses, a bicyclist came up from behind, drew level with him, and spoke. The man reportedly told Schaeffler never to speak again about his experience, otherwise something would happen to him. At first, Lothar Schaeffler did not take the man seriously. He noticed only that the stranger wore a long black coat or cape and a black broad-brimmed seaman's hat. Then his initial reaction turned into confusion. About 10 meters ahead of him, the bicycle and the rider simply disappeared. The sudden vanishing frightened him deeply. Several weeks later, Schaeffler began to experience episodes of fainting, which psychologist Streubel had earlier suggested could mark the onset of epilepsy. Schaeffler interpreted these collapses as the fulfillment of the bicyclist's threat and felt as though the man's presence remained near him. His nervousness increased to such a degree that he eventually became afraid to leave the house alone. In the spring of 1980, Schaeffler again encountered the mysterious man in the long black coat while walking along the street in the evening. The man approached him from behind, this time without a bicycle. He repeated the same threat as before. Then, just as in the first encounter, he vanished from sight. Schaeffler described the figure as dissolving into nothing. Mr. Streubel examined Schaeffler afterward. He reassured him that the fainting attacks were a normal medical condition, following the shock he had experienced, and not the result of any external influence. Streubel told him that these men tended to latch on to insecure individuals who feared they might be harmed, and that Schaeffler should simply dismiss the figure if he ever saw him again. The man, he added, could not harm him physically. This response helped Schaeffler considerably. He felt relieved that someone had taken his account seriously and had looked into his case. Investigators noted that witnesses of close encounters often suffer psychological strain, and that scientists who interview them sometimes find themselves acting as informal therapists. Schaeffler's persistent anxiety and missing time led to the hypothesis that the bicyclist figure he later described might have been a psychic projection, created as his mind attempted to cope with material that could not be recalled. Psychological examinations confirmed that the incident had left lasting emotional and neurological effects. MUFON-CES concluded that similar reports of post-encounter figures, often referred to in the literature as men in black, and understood as unexplained individuals who appear after a sighting and issue warnings, should receive psychiatric attention when needed. Follow-up assessments in 1980 and 1989 showed gradual improvement, and after completing medical and psychological treatment, partly funded by MUFON-CES, Schaeffler had regained good health by 1996, although the recovery took many years. That concludes our look at the Langenargen incident, first brought into wider circulation through Illebrand von Ludwiger's Best UFO Cases, Europe. What impresses us in particular is the texture of the record itself. Several people reported the same lights that night. Their accounts are independent, yet compatible. The follow-up with the principal witness stretches over years and gives us a rare view of how an encounter, whatever its nature, affects a person's continued existence and day-to-day life. At the same time, the limits are plain. This case offers no definitive physical trace, but we must not forget, the missing hour remains unresolved, and this detail speaks of a glaring inconsistency. If the bar had closed later, the staff would likely remember the extra hour, since unscheduled overtime is the kind of inconvenience people tend to notice. If it did close at 2, then an hour of time still has to be accounted for, and that sits uneasily beside the other facts that were established. For that reason, Langenargen stands as a noteworthy entry in the archive of the unexplained. It does not confirm non-human visitation, and it does not rule it out. It offers a constellation of observations, reactions, and aftershocks that invite patience rather than conclusions. Cases like this matter not because they solve a puzzle, but because they remind us how incomplete our models still are when people meet the unexpected. But as always here on Stories Lost, the final judgment lies with you. Thanks for the coffee. Thanks to all our members and Patreons.